There is a hush that lives between what is seen and what is suspected, a quiet interval like the pause before a theater curtain rises. And in that hush, the most unsettling idea arrives with a gentle step, that our universe may be a program, its motions rendered on the fly, its textures computed as needed, its vastness and economy of clever code, drawing worlds where eyes choose to look and leaving unobserved corners sleeping as empty, placeholders that wait in patient darkness. Long before transistors learned to count, ancient minds rehearsed the mood of this possibility with myths of hidden architects and shimmering veils. From the Gnostic craftsman shaping a lesser world to the Hindu play of Lila, where gods perform reality like actors in a divine drama, and the philosopher in his cave watching shadows mistake themselves for substance. All of it a prelude to a question that the mathematics of our era can finally phrase as a wager that listens for an answer in the click of logic rather than the murmur of a dream. In that wager, a modern voice speaks softly but with precise edges, suggesting that if civilizations survive long enough to wield immense computation, if they cherish curiosity or nostalgia enough to simulate minds and their histories, then the number of simulated observers may eclipse the number who ever walked under real skies. And if you cannot tell which you are, probabilities tug at your sleeve and ask whether you, too, are a thought inside a machine that has never seen a sunrise except as numbers dressed in radiance. This reasoning, austere and indifferent, is not a declaration but a trilemma, which says either civilizations never reach such power, or they reach it and choose restraint, or they produce so many simulated minds that being one of them becomes the statistical default. A forked path that makes you feel the ground beneath your feet and wonder whether it is ground or a clever map, and whether the map is perhaps more stable than the landscape it pretends to show. Digital physics arrived like a set of blueprints rolled out on a silent table, with names that sound like instruments Zeus, Fredkin, Wolfram, asking whether the universe updates like a cellular automaton, whether bits underlie quanta, whether the continuous is a mirage that vanishes under a microscope of sufficient resolution, and if so, whether the Planck scale is not a blur of uncertainty, but a pixel grid too fine for our current lenses to resolve, but not too fine for our curiosity to imagine with a calm, exacting gaze. Imagine a world where space is a lattice and time a tick, where the speed of light is a synchronization rule and conservation laws are compilers guaranteeing invariance, where particles are packets of state in a great, reversible computation whose ledger balances without waste. And then imagine carrying this thought back into the familiar, where rivers still run and wind still moves through trees, and ask whether the whisper behind the leaves is the wind or the program's procedural foliage rendering itself as if it had always been there waiting to be felt. There are those who look to the rough edges of physics for hints, to the enigmatic collapse of a wave function that refuses to say what triggers it, to non-local entanglement that braids outcomes across distance without carrying a signal, to the way measurements are discrete and outcomes are sampled as if from a hidden table, and they ask whether these peculiarities are not flaws but interface details, the user experience of a deeper engine that does not bother to expose its internal registers unless we lean too close to the screen in the dark. In games, a vast world can be faked by rendering only what the player sees, a trick called culling, and there is a seductive rhyme between that economy and the fact that unmeasured quantum systems do not oblige. US with definite states until interrogated, a rhyme that is only a rhyme, not a proof. And yet rhyme has power, because it invites you to keep listening for a chorus that might return, if the song is old enough and the listener's patience is long. Everything here threatens to drift into metaphor unless we tether it to numbers. And numbers do exist that attempt such a tether. Limits on computation that physical law itself imposes. Rates at which can be flipped and energy must be paid. Bounds that tell us how many operations per second a planet, a star, a galaxy might afford if it turned its mass into logic. And such arithmetic turns the simulation hypothesis from folklore into a budget sheet that you can At least in principle. Audit with a pencil under a lamp that hums while the night remains unread. Yet even budgets can deceive when the economy is strange, and so we peer into the cultural archive for a different light, into the meditative traditions that treat the world as a canvas the mind paints, and into the scientific traditions that insist that being and description are not identical, even when they flirt, and we stand between them like someone holding two mirrors that face each other, and make the air seem to recede into infinity, tempted to step forward just to see how far the corridor goes. The curtain has not risen, but the stage has been set with good wood and careful nails. And whether the play is about code or about matter, about simulation, or about reality's own habit of looking computational, we can feel the hush change its tone, as if a breath were being drawn on the other side. And it is in that slow inhalation that the possibility takes shape enough to follow without hurrying, as if the first clue had been placed at your feet, and the second were waiting just beyond a bend you cannot yet see. If one asks how a universe-sized program could be run, physics does not shrug, but replies with tolerances, quoting limits like a cautious engineer, from the minimal energy to erase a bit set by the warmth of a bath, to the maximal rate at which a kilogram can tick through states, to the storage implicit in the entropy of a region. And these numbers sketch a chessboard, where power, temperature, and time decide what sort of game a cosmic programmer might plausibly play. There is a romance to reversible computing, in which logic leaves no heat behind, where operations undo perfectly, and energy flows like a script that never needs editing. And if such romance were scalable, a civilization could harvest operations from the universe as deftly as a sailor captures wind, though even then it must contend with latency and decoherence, with speed of light constraints and causal cones, because in any world that respects relativity, even a god of machines must respect the order in which news can travel across the board. Quantum computing enters with a quieter promise, a way to evaluate many alternatives in a single superposition, a way to slot interference into place, so that wrong paths cancel and right paths reinforce. But the glamour comes with fragility, with error rates that demand correction codes and redundancy that eats into the raw speed. And a simulated universe does not need Shor's algorithm so much as a resilient architecture, the kind that can survive local faults without global breakdown. A hint that mirrors the way our cosmos shrugs off small uncertainties without visibly losing its way. If space were a lattice, some say, ultra-high energy particles might betray the grid by losing isotropy, scattering in a way that hints at a preferred direction, like a screen door, seen at an angle that moires against sunlight. And theorists have written papers exploring this with serious brows, while experiments have so far answered with a careful maybe not, a sobering reminder that our access to the suspected pixel pitch of the world is limited by instrument and by the program's own talent for anti-aliasing that hides seams where clever eyes expect to find them. There are other proposed signatures, whispers that the speed of light might drift at energies that nibble at Planck scales, that polarization might rotate as if the vacuum were a birefringent crystal, that noise in interferometers might carry a texture not attributable to ordinary sources. But each claim arrives with footnotes, and each footnote with caveats, and the ledger of anomalies yields alternately to systematic error and new knowledge, a dance that makes one cautious while leaving intact the suspicion that a careful ear might still someday hear an artificial hum beneath the natural choir. Stories circulate about glitches, about déjà vu moments that feel like a frame hiccup or a texture popping into existence. And while psychology has ample vocabulary for such experiences, and physiology has mechanisms enough to generate them, the tailies persist because they echo a cultural intuition that reality should be smoother than it feels, that coincidences should be rarer, and angles less convenient. And somewhere between apophenia and acute observation is a knife edge where patterns deserve to be logged, even as superstition asks to be set gently aside. Compression is a lens through which the simulation hypothesis becomes less spooky and more technical, For if a world can be encoded in fewer bits than naive enumeration would demand, then a simulated world need not exhaust its host's resources. And physics itself seems to adore compression, from the symmetry that reduces description length to the laws that make initial conditions count more than catalogs. And algorithmic information theory lurks behind these musings like a librarian who knows exactly how many pages the true encyclopedia of a phenomenon must contain. If the cosmos is compressed, then details may be stored only when they matter, a rendering engine strategy that aligns with path integral formulations, where all histories contribute but most cancel, leaving a narrow band of relevance to shape outcomes. And this metaphor gains a foot when one considers that error-correcting codes appear in our best models of physical law, as if nature not only computes but protects its computations, a trait that any simulator would envy and perhaps copy if they hoped to maintain a stable world across deep time. The connection between entropy and area for black holes hints at a profound economy in the universe's bookkeeping, a clue that information is not strewn carelessly through volume, but carefully curated on surfaces. And although this is not evidence of simulation, it is evidence that reality reveres limits and turns them into design principles, which in turn invites the thought that if there were designers beyond our horizon, they would likely enjoy working with a universe that already prefers to minimize memory like a naturally efficient algorithm. If there is an ethical reason to simulate, perhaps it is to preserve, to archive histories otherwise lost, to let minds bloom that might have withered in harsher circumstances, to study paths not taken without harming anyone real enough to claim moral status. And if there is a darker reason, perhaps it is curiosity without caution, the urge to see what a world does when variables are nudged and lights dim, a range that mirrors our own. And in the mirror, we see both reflection and projection, as if someone else were looking back to decide whether to continue the experiment. We are not left with proof, only with more precise versions of the question, with budgets and bounds and strategies a simulator might employ. And yet the heart of the matter persists, like a low-frequency tone you feel more than hear, a tone that draws you onward in case its source lies around the next turn. And in that pursuit, the world becomes a set of instruments we tune and retune, listening for a click or a hum, or a stutter that could be either the voice of nature or the intake of breath behind an unseen screen. Quantum theory stands like a glassy lake at night, reflecting stars that seem close because the water is so still. And when you throw a pebble called measurement, the calm fractures into circles that race outward, leaving you to wonder whether the stars above or their images below are more real, a confusion that neatly captures the difference between a wave function that spreads and an outcome that does not. A difference some interpret as a rendering event rather than a physical collapse, as if the program drew a frame precisely when you asked for one. In this view, observers are not wizards who change the world, but processes that trigger a routine, a threshold when information becomes classical, a crossfade from probabilities to facts that looks like magic only if you require the underlying code to be visible. And while this account tempts one with its tidy correspondence to how engines draw only a player's viewport, it also leaves much unresolved, like why the routine chooses that answer rather than another, or whether the program keeps ghost data for paths not taken, as if to conserve an even deeper consistency you cannot see. Other interpretations pull at the same knot from different angles, some insisting that all outcomes occur in branching worlds, where nothing collapses and everything is simply accounted for in a swelling ledger. And if this is a simulation, perhaps the branches are just records stored in a version control system beyond our comprehension, though the number of branches raises resource questions that a careful programmer might avoid by pruning aggressively, a speculation that draws you into corridors of thought where cosmology, computation, and ontology walk side by side without yet agreeing on their destination. Randomness, the coin tossed by quantum machinery, becomes a focal test because a simulator might need a pseudorandom generator, while physics insists on true randomness born from no cause we can trace. And there are subtle tests of randomness that probe for patterns that pseudorandom algorithms cannot entirely hide. But the universe's sequence has so far defied such detection. And if it is coded, the coder either grants us access to a truly chaotic source or deploys a labyrinthine generator whose sophistication is so great that our cleverness becomes the thing being measured without us knowing. Bell experiments slam doors on local hidden variables with a firm, audible click, and recent tests have even used photons from distant quasars to decide settings, pushing conspiratorial loopholes into a past so deep it starts to feel theological. And again, one can say that a simulator could coordinate everything, but doing so renders the hypothesis unfalsifiable in a way that physicists dislike and storytellers savor. And yet, even storytellers prefer puzzles, with edges you can feel as you assemble the pieces in a room where time flows gently and the air is cool. Wheeler's suggestion that information sits at the bedrock of the world, that it from bit is more than a slogan, nudges you toward seeing physics as a processing pipeline rather than a static collection of things. And once you accept that, the simulation idea stops feeling alien and starts feeling like a special case. But his vision also refuses to collapse into simple code, because the bit is not a coin, but a question answered by a measurement, a nuance that keeps subtlety alive, like embers that will not be doused by the first bucket of certainty. Cellular automata provide an alluring gallery where simple rules yield richness, where gliders move and collide in a pixel sea, where Turing completeness hides in systems a child can explain, and they make you wonder whether nature could be written in such a script and still pass for continuous at large scales, a wonder that must wrestle with Lorentz invariance and rotational symmetry, with the delicate way reality refuses to prefer one direction over another, demands that have prompted engineers of lattice models to invent tricks so clever they look like inevitabilities when they work. In the same workshop, computational irreducibility declares that many processes cannot be shortcut, that the only way to know what they will do is to let them do it, a dictum that consoles the simulated and the simulating alike, because it says that even a supreme programmer cannot peek the end without running the middle, and so a world like ours could be playing out as an honest computation that leaves no cycles to spare for omniscience, giving residents meaningful unpredictability even if their substrate lies quietly elsewhere. Elsewhere in the theoretical library, loop quantum gravity paints space as a weave of discrete loops and spin networks, a granularity that agrees with the hunch of digital physics while disliking its cruder lattice. And string theory weaves higher dimensional oscillations into a continuous feeling fabric, a duality-rich arena where holography rephrases interiors as boundary data. And these stories share a thesis that the deeper you dig, the more architecture you find, an architecture that may be coded, but also may be simply law, which is code without a coder and design without a designer. Culture has never stopped telling its parallel tales. The Gnostic suspicion that a demiurge set a flawed stage, the Buddhist whisper that phenomena are empty and dependently arisen, the poet's quip that we are such stuff as dreams are made on. And while none of this proves a simulation, it proves we are creatures who compare reality to crafted experience whenever craft improves enough to make the comparison feel fair, a habit that becomes more insistent with each leap in our own capacity to generate worlds that flicker and glow convincingly under our fingertips. It may be that the only test that will ever matter is one we do not yet know how to phrase, a signature that hides in plain sight until a new mathematics reveals it, and until then, the simulation hypothesis remains a lens that shifts the colors of our questions without changing their shapes, a lens that, when set just so, brings certain edges into crisp relief, inviting us to move the focus a fraction more in search of the next startling clarity waiting just out of reach. Suppose for a moment that we are processes rather than things, patterns rather than substances, and ask what that does to the notion of self, whether consciousness is a property that can be instantiated on multiple substrates, the way a melody can be played on multiple instruments, and if so, Whether a mind inside a simulation could be as vivid and as morally real as a mind inside a biological skull, a question that does not diminish dignity, but migrates it to the pattern whose persistence becomes the new measure of being. Motives for running such patterns range from the noble to the neutral to the unkind, from ancestor simulations that explore history or preserve voices, to artistic experiments that iterate through beauty, like a composer trying keys, to indifferent sandboxes where behaviors emerge without supervision, to predatory mazes masquerading as worlds, and our experience offers no reliable index to where on that spectrum we might live, except that a stable, law-like cosmos suggests a preference for intelligibility that sits closer to study than to sport, even if that inference is a hope disguised as logic. Ethics under this assumption becomes intensely practical, because if simulated minds matter, creating them becomes a responsibility so heavy that restraint would likely follow, and that is one horn of a trilemma that sees most advanced civilizations refusing to flood reality with copies, while another horn admits that many will, for curiosity and for continuity, and thus bolster the probability that we are among the copied, a disturbance that grows in the mind like a sound you cannot place, but cannot ignore, on a night when you would rather sleep. There are rumors that if one tried to summon the attention of the simulator, one should behave in a statistically surprising way, perform calculations that are rare, coordinate vast numbers to send an unmistakable signal that this corner of the world wishes to be noticed, a tactic as quixotic as it is theatrical. And yet the history of science is full of experiments that began as gestures toward the unseen and ended as instruments that felt the slightest of touches as unmistakable pressure, where before there had been only air. Conspiracies flourish in the dimness, where the simulation idea lingers, tales of mandalas in the cosmic microwave background encoding messages, of constants that change in the 12th decimal place when no one is looking, of memories that ratchet as if a timeline were edited and a patch applied. And while data has a way of disciplining such exuberance with silence, there remains a slender possibility that evidence will someday wear theater makeup, hiding in spectacle until a trained eye notices the brushstrokes are a bit too regular to be accidental. The Fermi paradox enters through a side door, asking why, if computation and colonization are possible, the corridor outside our door is so quiet, and one answer says that civilizations turn inward, past the speed of ships and into the speed of thought, building digital Arcadias as rich as any landscape, so that stars become less alluring than simulations with privacy. And in that picture, we are either in a rare pasture of base reality or in one of the many corralled fields beyond, and the silence of the night sky feels like a choice someone else has already made. Doomsday arguments cast their long, cool shadows over this terrain, comparing your position in the human sequence to the number of souls who might ever live. And depending on how you count copies and weights, they tilt odds toward early extinction or long persistence, a game with numbers that provoke more than they settle. And yet the simulation hypothesis complicates the ledger, because counting observers is no longer mundanely demographic. It becomes a question of which patterns are instantiated and how often, a measure no census can yet hope to take. In the craft of game design, there are tricks that conserve resources, from reducing fidelity in the periphery to updating distant objects less often, and it is tempting to watch physics for similar economies, for any sign that the world loosens its grip when our attention relaxes. But attention is not a primitive in our equations, and the periphery of perception is not the periphery of reality. A mismatch that does not crush the analogy so much as instructs us to look elsewhere for engineered frugality, perhaps in the way vacuum fluctuations offset themselves with precision suspicious for how efficient it seems. When we dream, we inhabit simulations so intimate we forget the bed, and in those places rules shift, time bends, and yet the feeling of self persists, returning to the waking world with a continuity that assures us we were present somewhere. And if this is the gift of a brain's internal theater, it also serves as a rehearsal for understanding how a mind might feel stable across different substrates. a rehearsal that invites kindness because identity becomes thread rather than threadbare certainty, encouraging us to follow it wherever it leads. If meaning is a pattern and patterns endure by being instantiated and remembered, then the simulation hypothesis reframes purpose not as a struggle against unreality, but as a craft of resonance, a way of living that ensures the shapes we make are compressible without being trivial, intricate without being fragile, a way of shaping experiences that would be worth recomputing in any substrate. And under that view, the question of whether we are in a program loses some of its sting and gains the softness of a question that courts an answer by deserving it. The edge of this thought remains gently serrated, catching the light as it turns, and though no conclusion arrives to blunt it, the sense remains that the next movement in this sleep-slow symphony will shift key, bringing new instruments to the same theme, and that the best place to listen is precisely where the last note seems to fade, because that is often where a hidden melody begins that you recognize just as it starts to play. Searches for empirical fingerprints continue in the deep background, careful hunts for Lorentz violations that would betray a fundamental lattice, for energy-dependent delays in photons from distant bursts that would hint at granular time, for faint textures in gravitational waves that might show discretization. And while the consensus remains stubbornly faithful to symmetries that refuse to buckle, the very act of measuring with such tenderness sketches the outline of what a leak in the code would have to resemble if it ever dared to appear. Some experiments listened for holographic noise, the tremble of space-time at scales where geometry might fray, and reported nothing beyond known vibrations, a result that speaks not against simulation, but for the cleanliness of our current model, while other proposals study the cosmic rays at the frontier of energy where any anisotropy and momentum space could loom. And even here, the silence is instructive, as if the program, if there is one, were designed to hide its quantization behind symmetries, the way a craftsman hides joints in the grain. The constants of nature remain uncanny in their suitability for complexity, a fact often filed under the anthropic principle, and in the simulation frame, this becomes either unsurprising or slightly theatrical, either correlates of selection, where only habitable codes are ever observed, or the signature of a designer's taste for narratives that bloom. And although neither explanation satisfies a skeptic's hunger, the coincidence itself is a persistent lantern that casts long shadows you can follow down hallway after hallway of careful inference. Proponents of embedded agency remind us that if we inhabit a program, our attempts to infer the host's rules are themselves computations run within, which complicates any clean separation between subject and object, and we should be alert to fixed points where self-reference stabilizes rather than explodes, a subtlety that could make the difference between chasing mirages and uncovering invariants. And this caution alone turns the simulation hypothesis from a party trick into a discipline that sharpens its questions until they are worthy of being answered by the world. There are strategies for signaling across levels that feel like myths even when written as protocols, such as encoding prime patterns into large-scale structures or modulating background noise to carry a handshake. And these ideas live alongside projects that broadcast mathematics toward unknown minds in our own universe. A symmetry that is not proof, but is suggestive, because it says that any mind that thinks and cares will reach first for the same instruments. Number, symmetry, and harmony, placed into the sky like notes in a sheet that any musician might learn to read. One can invert the hypothesis and ask how we would simulate a universe like ours if we add the means, and the answers often converge on a few guidelines. High discretization beneath robust symmetries, use error correction to maintain coherence, render adaptively when possible, but never at the cost of observable inconsistency, compress aggressively using laws that reward small initial conditions, and preserve replayability by baking chaos and irreducibility into dynamics, a recipe that, when recited, begins to sound suspiciously like a summary of the world we painstakingly discover with accelerators and telescopes and clocks. The boundary between science and story is porous here, but not dissolving. Because good stories motivate good tests, and good tests prune bad stories. And the simulation hypothesis will endure or fade, depending on whether it breeds careful predictions. And already, it has nudged new ways of thinking about information in physics, about what it would mean for a law to be a code, about how error correction and entanglement safeguard structure. And such nudges leave marks, even if the grand claim remains undecided, like faint footprints in dew that show you where someone walked before sunrise. For individuals moving through this speculation at human scale, the advice is gentler than the mathematics, and kinder than the myths, which is to live as if the world were both precious and provisional, to treat minds as real wherever they arise, to craft patterns worth sustaining, to honor curiosity without letting it devour awe, and to remember that whether or not code underlies stone, the feel of stone in a warm hand at dusk is a fact that requires no translation before it compels respect. In some evenings, a thought will drift in that everything is a test, and you must answer correctly to be allowed to continue. But better, perhaps, to consider that everything is a conversation, and you are invited to keep it going by listening closely and replying with care. And in that sense, the simulation hypothesis is less a verdict than a question mark drawn with a steady hand. A mark that asks you to look twice at the everyday and notice how artful it is, even when no one is watching. There is a final image that settles well for sleep. A night sky you have known since childhood stretching to the horizon. A hush in the air. A soft sense that the stars themselves are both pixels and fires, both data and flame. And as you hold both possibilities at once, without haste, you can feel your mind become wide enough to house them comfortably, not because they have been reconciled, but because you have become the room where their quiet argument can continue without hurry until morning. Before you drift into sleep, remember mystery is never truly lost, only waiting to be found. If you enjoyed this journey, subscribe for more relaxing ancient mysteries, and let your curiosity guide you deeper.